So past his prologue, uncovering Verdi's Aida. Um, so Verdi was long saying that he was going to retire. He composed 19 operas in 17 years, which is pretty astounding to think. And I think it's even more astounding to think that um, many of those early operas, those first 19 operas, are still operas that we perform very regularly, both at the Met and around the world. I'm talking Rigoletto, Il Trovatore, La Traviata, Nabucco. These are all in this period that Verdi not very affectionately referred to his years in the galley. And so after this period, in 1859, Nick, if you could give the next slide, please. He wrote in a letter to his longtime librettist, Francesco Maria Piave, I am now the complete countryman. He's alluding to the fact that he now lives on this estate in the country. He has sort of a little farming operation. He has lots of land. He says, I am now the complete countryman. I hope I have bidden farewell to the muses, and that I shall never again feel the temptation to take up my pen. So he was done, or so he said. But you'll note this was in 1859, and fortunately for the world and for us, over the course of the next 34 years, he would compose not 19, but 5 more operas. But all 5 are 5 of the greatest pieces of opera that the world has ever known. Um, and then in addition to those 5, he also composed the Requiem Mass. These are all towering masterpieces, so we can forgive him for giving us so few operas in the second half of his composing careers. And one of those operas was Aida that we're going to talk about tonight. But because Verdi was now comfortable, he had made a lot of money. He was comfortable in his estate. He could be much more discriminating about which commissions he chose. He didn't feel like he had to accept every contract just to make ends meet. So, Nick, if you could bring up the next slide, please. So that brings us to Aida, which starts with, in a way, with this man, Auguste Mariette, who is involved in one of the great myths of opera, and it surrounds Aida. So you may have seen reported in many places, including reputable places, that Aida was commissioned to celebrate the opening of the Cairo Opera House that was created as part of the festivities celebrating the completion of the Suez Canal. That's false. Uh, that's a myth. But it is understandable why people have this myth. People believe that the reason that the Opera House opened with Rigoletto in 1869 was because of something, well, a true story we'll come to in a bit, that the sets and costumes for Aida were delayed because of the Franco-Prussian War. But that's not the whole truth. And we know it's not the whole truth because Verdi didn't even receive the outline, the scenario that would become Aida until the spring of 1870, which is half a year after the canal was already open and the Opera House was already open. So I urge you all, do not spread this myth that Aida was commissioned for the opening of the Suez Canal. But the reason that this myth has sort of continued through history is understandable because it's sort of conflating 2 actually truthful stories. The first is that the Khedive of Egypt, who was building this new opera house to celebrate the Suez Canal, had asked Verdi to compose an ode in honor of this celebration. So that's on the one hand for the opening, and Verdi flat out declined, and he says, I don't write occasion pieces. I'm not doing that anymore. So that's on the one hand. On the other side, we have Auguste Mariette, who he was a French Egyptologist who was originally commissioned by the Louvre in France to go to Egypt and to do some archaeological work, and actually almost by happenstance started making these great discoveries. And so the Khedive appointed him with the title of Bey, B-E-Y, and put him in charge of excavations for, he wanted to find all of these great relics of his kingdom. And actually, it was Mariette who is pictured here and helped unearth the Sphinx, which is what you see pictured on the right. Nick has nicely circled him for you all. And he also helped found the first Egyptian museum. So Mariette he was French, and he wanted an excuse to have a paid trip to go back to Paris. So he created this scenario for a new opera that he proposed to the Khedive could be used to find a composer, not necessarily Verdi, to find a composer to set this opera to open the opera house. So that's where the two myths sort of lie. Mariette has this story that he's shopping around. He doesn't really care about the composer. He just wants the trip to Paris. And on the other hand, we have this Verdi being commissioned to write this ode. Mariette was friends with Camille Dulocle, who was, and forgive my poor French pronunciations, everyone. He was the librettist that Verdi worked with on Don Carlos, and he was trying to get Verdi to write another opera for Paris. Mariette was friends, and Mariette wrote to Dulocle giving him this scenario, and he said, quote, "If the scenario seems to you suitable, you must write to me that the subject chosen is so archaeologically Egyptian and Egyptological that you can't write the libretto without a full-time policeman at your side." That would be Mariette. "And besides that, my presence in Paris is absolutely necessary for the decors and the costumes. If I could get to Paris this summer, my goal would be attained." So this is all Mariette's side mission to get out of Egypt and to go back to Paris for a little while. So Dulocle sent this scenario to Verdi in a bundle of other things that he was sending Verdi to consider to set. And Verdi was interested in this scenario. And he was also quite happy when the Khedive offered him 150,000 francs, which was 4 times what he received for Don Carlos only 3 years earlier. So the icing was on the cake. Verdi agreed. Dulocle created a French libretto, but Verdi wanted the opera in Italian. He was never thrilled with how Don Carlos turned out, and evidenced by the fact that as soon as he got back to Italy, it was translated into Italian. And so he worked with Antonio Ghislanzoni to create the libretto. Ghislanzoni had worked with Verdi to create revisions for La Forza del Destino recently. So, and Verdi was very enthusiastic for the project. He created the score. He completed the score in only 4 months, which, if any of you, I'm sure you have been looking into Aida, it is quite astounding that this masterpiece could be created pretty much in 4 months, way ahead of schedule. And it was actually, if you could bring up the next slide, Nick, Mariette, who did in fact create, who designed costumes and scenery for the first production, very much inspired by what he was seeing, all the archaeological discoveries that he was making in Egypt. Now, it is true that while the opera was supposed to premiere in January 1871, it was delayed by the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War. Paris was under siege, and so all the sets and costumes that were built for the production were trapped and couldn't get out. And so it wasn't until Christmas Eve 1871 that Aida did premiere in Cairo, and shortly after there, it premiered at La Scala, the famous opera house in Milan. That's the true story, and I'm sticking to it, and I hope you will too. And Melanie, I'm sure, will talk more about this in the next part of this conference, sorry. But I'll just touch on this concept of Mariette discovering tombs, creating the scenario, the whole idea of Aida being framed through the lens of the archaeological the archaeologist, is something that's explored in the production that will be in live in HD in a week and a half. But I won't preempt her too much. So if you could go to the next slide, Nick. So let's get started with Aida. What is this great opera that has brought us all here tonight? As you can see here on the right, this is the cover of the vocal edition score of Aida, which is the year after the world premiere, depicting the final scene in the tomb, where on the below you see Aida and Radame, spoiler alert, expiring in the tomb, and above you see the temple. And this idea to have the tomb on one level and the temple above was actually Verdi's inclusion. He added that to the libretto. That was not originally introduced by Mariette or the librettist. And on the other side, you have a drawing of Verdi himself conducting the premiere of Aida in Paris in 1880. So, on the one hand, Aida is the epitome of grand opera, the grandest opera of all grand operas, and with a huge cast when you consider that there are 8 soloists, a conductor, obviously, a chorus of nearly 100, an orchestra of more than 80 musicians, including offstage musicians who are playing sometimes, onstage, 6 onstage trumpeters during the triumphal scene, a few dozen dancers, another dozen or more actors, and sometimes, depending on space limitations, horses, camels. In Rome, they do it outdoor in the old Roman baths with an elephant. It is as grand as it gets. The scenery, the costumes, it is opera's greatest spectacle. But at the same time, when you actually clear away the big crowd scenes, it is really an intimate love story. That it's just a love triangle between Aida, an Ethiopian princess held captive in Egypt, her love for the Egyptian warrior Radames, and then the Egyptian princess Amneris, who loves Radames, whom Aida serves, and all of the complex personal entanglements that brings. And musically, it is what our music director, Unique Nizes, again, who is conducting this production, calls basically a collection of greatest hits. It is some of Verdi's most popular, enduring, and masterful music that he ever created. There are 3 great arias. There's one for the tenor, which is notorious for being right at the beginning, and all tenors fear it. Celeste Aida. It pretty much opens the opera. And then there are 2 arias for the soprano who portrays Aida, though somewhat surprisingly, neither Amneris, the leading mezzo-soprano, nor Amanazzo, the leading baritone, gets an aria of their own at all. So that's pretty surprising when you consider Italian opera and the egos that come with those singers back then, who all would have wanted an aria. The real dramatic core of the opera is conveyed through the ensembles. So, Nick, if you could go to the next slide. Thank you. So for a long time, Verdi was trying to move towards more veristic, dramatic representation on stage. We don't really think of Verdi as that being one of the main themes of his career, partially because he's so overshadowed by Richard Wagner, who created such radical rethinking of the relationship, radically rethought the relationship between music and drama, and really eventually created these huge, through-composed, form-breaking operas. Verdi never got that far, but as early as 1851, with the premiere of Rigoletto, this quote is from right after, he said, "I conceived Rigoletto without arias, without finales, but only as an unbroken chain of duets." Now, he didn't totally achieve this goal, but even as early as Rigoletto, he was trying to break away from the formal structure that Italian opera had, recitative number, and was trying to create something that more closely matched natural speech, more closely matched spoken drama. So in Aida, there are 5 large-scale duets, if I counted correctly, and 2 equally important trios, and they take up the bulk of the action in Aida. And each of these covers a lot of ground. Each comprises many different sections. It's not just one musical form. They evolve. They adhere to the changes in the contours of the drama. And aside from Aida's second aria, O Patria Mia, in aside from Aida's second aria, O Patria Mia, nearly all of Act 3 is divided between Aida's duet with Amonasro, her duet with Radames, and then big trio for the three of them. Obviously, there's a little bit bookending that, but it's largely two duets and a trio, and it's not short. Next slide, please, Nick. So Aida also, if we move away from the music and we look at the drama, it explores three themes to which Verdi was regularly returning throughout his career. And those are the parent and child relationship, the plight of the oppressed people, and the juxtaposition of public life versus private life. So let's dive into each of these. So the first is the parent-child relationship. At the core of many of Verdi's most beloved masterpieces, spanning his career, is the relationship between a parent and a child. So think Rigoletto and Gilda in Rigoletto, how close that relationship is. Or right after it, Azucena and Manrico in Trovatore. Or right after that, Germont and Alfredo, a true father-son. Or even Germont, the father, and Violetta, who sort of could be seeing him as the father she never had and who she wants to please in La Traviata. It continues with Simon Boccanegra and even Don Carlos. These parent-child relationships are at the core of many of Verdi's works. And one reason, next slide please, Nick, is because tragedy in Verdi's early life never left him. Between 1838 and 1840, Verdi lost his two infant children in rather quick succession, and then his wife, who's pictured here, Margherita Barezzi, when she was only 26 years old. That is an impact. So Verdi at the time, by 1840, would have been, quick math, 27. And all of this happens, which is unthinkable. That left an impact on him, obviously, throughout his entire life. And eventually he found a new partner, Giuseppina Strepponi. They eventually married. That was a little scandalous because she had children, and that's another story for another day. But with Verdi, she never had children. Eventually, they adopted Verdi's cousin's daughter, but that was more than 20 years later. So he was already in his late 40s when he was adopting this girl when she was 7. So he never really knew in his own life the father-child relationship. And so that's one reason we have speculated that he keeps coming back to this. So this theme is explored throughout Aida with the relationship between Aida and her father, Amonasro. And it comes to a head in Act 3. And so we're about to see a clip. And in this clip, Amonasro has been taken captive in Egypt, and he is the leader, he's the king of Ethiopia, but has not revealed his identity and is trying to find a way to take revenge on the Egyptians, and asks Aida to get from Radames secret battle information. So we'll watch this clip, which is from the production that you'll all see. It's Angel Blue, who is our Aida, and Quinn Kelsey, who is our Amonasro.
Col fuoco struggete le nostre coi terrore le stragi le morti al vostro furore più freddo del mare e figati frutti di sangue scorrono sulle chifade visti vedi dai negri vortici si levano gli istinti di additare essi e gridano perché la patria vuole una larva orribile fra l'ubriaco e s'affaccia trema di scarne braccia, sul capo volevo. Come bella, la misera, non sei mia figlia dei faraoni, tu sei la schiava.
Wow.
Indeed. And the whole opera's that good. Uh, so this relationship actually complicates the typical pattern in Verdi's operas because unlike Rigoletto, who is compassionate to the point of sheltering Gilda, you have in Amonasro a father who uses his status as parent to manipulate his daughter, in even invoking the specter of his late wife, her late mother, to further twist in the knife and get her to reveal this information. And it also, you hear him singing about the conquered peoples who only she can save, and that brings us to the second theme. Nick, if we can move on to our next slide, which is the plight of the oppressed people, which is another subject that really moved Verdi's heart. So Verdi was born, we can move into the next slide, Nick. So Verdi was born into a nation that wasn't really a nation. It was under occupation, largely by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but partially territories allied with France, partially Spain. And our concept of Italy, the nation, wasn't really established until the unification in 1861, when all but Rome and the Papal States came together as the nation of Italy, and then Rome was eventually captured and incorporated in the nation in the next decade. So for most of for the first half of his life, basically, Verdi's life and work were influenced by the Risorgimento, this movement for Italian liberation. And there was sort of a chicken and egg situation. Were his works influenced by the Risorgimento? Did the Risorgimento influence his works? It's all tied in, and it's first can be seen with his third opera, Nabucco, where the enslaved Hebrew people were quickly seen by the audience as stand-ins for the Italian people living under Austrian rule, though Verdi always said that that was never his intention. And the Act 3 chorus of the Hebrew slaves, Va Pensiero, became this anthem for freedom that went far beyond the confines of the opera house and has endured as a sort of unofficial Italian national anthem to this day. And so Verdi continued to incorporate these themes of the people living under oppression into many of his operas, going so far as to in his operatic adaptation of Macbeth, adding a scene that doesn't appear in Shakespeare of the refugees who have fled Macbeth's tyranny, singing about their patria oppressa, their oppressed fatherland. And actually, the phrase "Viva Verdi" was scrawled as graffiti during the Risorgimento, not only to extol how much people liked his works, but the VERDI stood in for Vittorio Emanuele Re, King d'Italia, of Italy, Vittorio Emanuele, King of Italy, who was the king, the figure that would eventually unite Italy as the first king of United Italy. And so Aida reflects on this, especially in her two arias. In the first act, Ritorna Vincitor, she's just cried out that she wants Radames. She's joined the priests and the warriors and Amneris and the pharaoh, calling Radames to return from battle a victor. And then she realizes in her aria right after that for him to be victorious would mean that her father and her homeland and her fellow countrymen would all be defeated. So she's torn between her love and her country. And this continues in Act 3's her aria O Patria Mia, in which she says that as a captive in Egypt, she will never see her fatherland again. And then the third theme that Verdi explores is the private lives and the inner humanity of those on the public stage. So Verdi was increasingly interested in offering nuanced, three-dimensional portrayals of figures who maybe in previous operatic eras were depicted as mere archetypes. He wanted to see what the people in power and who were being seen publicly were thinking and feeling behind closed doors. One opera that is lesser known is his Stifalio, which is right before Rigoletto, and it's about a Protestant minister whose wife is having an affair, and Stifalio has to decide whether in his private life he can live up to the values that he espouses from the pulpit. Um, this is throughout his career in Don Carlos, right before Aida. You have this great juxtaposition of a scene in which King Philip II of Spain, who basically at the time ruled the Western world, you have this great scene of triumph, and then the next scene, he's alone in his study and it's a sleepless night because he realizes and is reflecting that his wife doesn't love him. So the great public figure is toppled by his own personal demons. And even La Traviata, which today seems like this pleasant story about a woman searching for love, was shocking to think that Verdi would take someone on the margins of society, a courtesan, and give her more agency and humanity than any of the well-to-do bourgeois characters around her. So all three of these themes come to a head and are interwoven, especially in the triumphal scene in Act Two, which on one hand, audiences often focus on the spectacle, the pageantry, and the amazing music. Um, and that is not to trivialize it at all. But Verdi, being the master that he is much, it's for him, it's much more sophisticated than mere crowd pleasing. So I'll just illustrate one moment as we come towards the end of our time that illustrates all of this. And it's going to be an audio clip, so I'll set it up and then we'll listen. But basically, Radames, after being lauded this victor over the Ethiopians, asks that the prisoners be brought before all of the assembled multitudes, the priests, the warriors, the pharaoh, the people. Um, and Aida, seeing her father, without thinking, cries out that she is reunited with him. And he doesn't reveal his identity. He knows that as the king and the leader of the warring side, the other side in war, he will be executed. And so he lies. He says that the king of Ethiopia is dead, and that they can never make a comeback. And he asks for the pharaoh's mercy on him and his people. And so then what we're about to hear has multiple parts. There's this large scale ensemble that's only possible in opera, where first we'll hear Aida and her fellow Ethiopians taking up this call for mercy. Then you'll hear the priests fight back against that, saying, no, have no mercy. Then you have the Egyptian people joining with the Ethiopians calling for pity. Then you'll hear Radames, his personal feelings coming out. He only sees Aida and her suffering and how much love he has for her and how he wants to take her out of this suffering. And then Amneris, who, having recently discovered that Aida is her rival for Radames' love, only longs for vengeance. So it's a depiction that's only possible in opera in which all of these voices are happening at once, but it's not cacophony. It is one of the most grand musical outpourings. But at the end, Verdi tells us who actually matters. All the voices die away except for one, and that is Aida. She is the human at the center of this whole spectacle. So if Nick could play it, and I'll just quickly point out as we go who's singing when, since we don't have a translation. So this is Aida and the Ethiopians. The priest, the people. Radames,
Thank you. 'Tis the Lord, 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 '
But at the end of the day, it is Aida, sung by the remarkable Leontine Price in this clip, who holds our attention because of her humanity more than any role she may play on the public or private stage. So that's just one of the many musical and dramatic delights that await you on January 25th at Aida live in HD. And I hope that this has given you just a few insights into Verdi's epic masterpiece that is also one of the most intimate operas of all time. So thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them now.